Hello, for those who are just joining, my name is Lisa Koppelman and I'm very excited to see you joining us today. We'll get started in just a moment. So again, this is Lisa Koppelman. We're just going to give people one more minute to join and then we'll get going. But I did want to say welcome and I'm delighted for those who are here today. All right, so I think we should get started out of respect for everyone's time. My name is Lisa Koppelman. I'm a program director and the team director at the MRCT Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. Before we get started, I first want to, again, thank all the panelists, all the speakers, all the attendees, and I'd like to just run through some quick housekeeping details. First, please note that all the speakers today are representing their own opinions, not necessarily the institutions that they're affiliated with. We are recording this session so that we can make it available later on the MRCT Center website and the MRCT YouTube channel. Please note that the closed captioning is enabled. So if you go to the bottom of your screen and you see CC and a box above live transcript, if you click on that, you will see translation as we're closed captioning as we're speaking. I'd also like to direct you to two buttons at the bottom of your screen. I'd encourage you all to use the chat function for communicating with others, participants, or for sharing information. And I'd ask that you please use the Q&A or the question and answer button to pose questions for the speakers when we get to that portion of the webinar. I'll quickly run through the agenda. After I offer some brief opening remarks, we'll be showing a brief video produced by close colleagues of ours, the International Children's Advisory Network, or ICANN. After the video, we'll be delighted to welcome Dr. Pek Young Chia, who will be offering a keynote address for this webinar, and that will be followed by a moderated panel discussion, and all the introductions will be made at that time. Please note that all the speakers have amazing bios that we are sharing with a bio book. So just note that the introductions will be brief. So with that, let me just offer you a little bit of information about the MRCT Center. Kristen, can you pull up the slides, please? Thank you. Thank you. So the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center, the MRCT Center, is a research and policy center that is situated between the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts. Our vision is to improve the integrity, the safety, and the rigor of global clinical trials. And we do that by working through our mission, which is to engage diverse stakeholders who define emerging issues related to clinical trials. We then create and implement solutions that are ethical, actionable, practical, and scalable. So with that as a backdrop, next slide, please. Several years ago, we had a series of scoping discussions with a number of experts in various fields of pediatrics, ethics, clinical trials. And we realized that in spite of a number of pockets of progress around the world and a lot of great work being done, a number of issues remain in the conduct of clinical trials for kids. So we kicked off a project called Promoting Global Clinical Research in Children. And really at the heart of it is the shared sentiment that children deserve access to safe and effective medicines. And they can only gain that access if they are included safely and properly in clinical trials. So despite the work, again, that's been done, there are persistent ethical issues that remain. There are differing or non-existent regulations country to country. There are challenges with trial initiation, trial conduct, something that we heard repeatedly over the many 90-minute meetings that we held over more than a year. The pediatric patient and family voice is not routinely solicited, nor is it included in the clinical research life cycle or the product development. And really, at the end of the day, what we've come to be united around is the fact that children and those who have their interests are not routinely offered a seat at the table. Next slide, please. So with that, we gathered together a leadership team that included people from academia, the EMA, industry, various participant advocates, and we pulled together a very large and very diverse stakeholder work group representing various interests and individuals from all over the globe. And we gathered for more than a year with a series of 90-minute meetings with this large work group and several smaller, sort of more thematically streamed work groups to talk very broadly about identifying and proposing solutions to some of the challenges that continue to persist in the regulatory, the ethical, and the operational spaces. Next slide, please. So the webinar series that we are pleased to bring you today is an offshoot of that project, promoting global clinical research in children. So the series is called Advancing International Pediatric Clinical Research, and it's funded in part through an FDA Scientific Conference Grant Award. And we were tasked with hosting 5 webinars. This is the third. We have hosted and presented each session twice. We have similar content, but different speakers and panelists. And we do that to really allow for wider attendance, wider participation, and to underscore that this is really global work. And without being united across the globe, the challenges will remain. Next slide. So the first in the series was presented back in October of 2021, and it was all about lessons learned from COVID-19 with kids. Next slide, please. Oh, it's right there, sorry. And you know, as I was saying earlier, we know that kids often are not really a part of the conversation, and that was very clear during the beginning time of the COVID pandemic, and also when the vaccine trials were underway. So we had 2 very interesting panel discussions in each of the sessions talking about the appropriate time to initiate vaccine trials with children, and also issues around infrastructure and what is needed to quickly stand up the infrastructure necessary to run clinical trials. In February of this year, 2022, we hosted our second webinar, which was called Time to Listen, Hearing from Young People in Clinical Research. And that had everything to do with elevating the voices of young people in clinical research, which, as I mentioned, became a very important theme throughout these various work group discussions that we held. Today and yesterday, we hosted the first of this third webinar, Assent and Consent in the Field, with a particular focus on issues of consent, culture, context, and respect. We look forward to the fourth webinar, which we are in the process of planning. It will be sometime in late November, and we'll focus on the regulatory convergence to facilitate international cooperation specific to pediatric clinical trials. Stay tuned for more details about that, and also the fifth webinar that will be hosted sometime early in 2023. So with that, next slide, please. I'm really delighted to introduce a short video that, as I mentioned earlier, has been produced by ICANN, the International Children's Advisory Network. It's called Prioritizing Young People's Voices in Clinical Research. So a big shout out to the kids, the families who support them, and ICANN for producing and sharing this video. And I really love to start these webinars. This is the second in a 3-part series, because it's a really good reminder to all of us that the reason we do this work, it's not about, you know, big lofty ideals, although all those, you know, intricate academic learnings are involved, but it's really about the kids and getting them the access they need to the medicines at the right time. So with that, I invite you to watch this short video. Thank you.
My first name is Abby. I'm 16 years old and I'm from the United States.
My name is Raymond. I'm 14. Uganda.
Meu nome é Théo e eu tenho 11 anos. Brasil.
My name is Jatin. I am 16 years old and I live in India.
My name is Angel. I am 11 years old. Uganda.
What do you wish your doctors had understood about you or asked you?
मेरे डॉक्टर मेरे को समझते हैं, मेरे को जानते हैं और जो मेरे डॉक्टर मेरे को जानते हैं वही जानकारी वो अगर कभी मीटिंग होती है, सेरेमनी कुछ होता है तो मेरे डॉक्टर उसमें मेरे इनपुट्स उस कार्यक्रम में शामिल करते हैं और अगर मेरे को जानना है कि मेरे डॉक्टर्स मेरे को समझते हैं तो मैं डॉक्टर की अनुपस्थिति में उधर जाकर उन लोगों से पूछ सकता हूँ कि मेरे डॉक्टर मेरे बारे में पॉजिटिव कह रहे थे या नेगेटिव, तो इससे मेरे को लगता है कि मेरे डॉक्टर मेरे को जानते हैं।
I wish they understood that I like being a young researcher to be part of some important science discoveries.
Eu queria dizer que vocês fazem um ótimo trabalho com isso e que isso pode ajudar as pessoas a saberem se falta alguma coisa e se isso está sendo bom. Então, ótimo trabalho. Bom.
You know, I feel like it was more difficult talking with the doctors because when I was going to like surgery and all, it was mostly the nurses in the room. So I didn't really get that good solid connection with the doctor where they kind of asked about, you know, like maybe what activities I enjoyed or kind of gave a better relationship or just interest in kind of what was in my background and what I did outside of just the purpose of healing me. And so I think just, you know, providing that little like, I guess not patient to doctor type of relationship and just person to person to develop a strong connection.
I wish the doctors understood that the effects of clinical trials to young people. It helps the young people to express their health problems.
What are your thoughts on how decisions are made by young people and their parents or guardians to be involved or not in clinical research?
First of all, जो युवा सोचता है वह सोचता है उसका पर्सनल इंटरेस्ट होता है इसमें कि हम भाग लें, इससे हमारे जीवन पर असर पड़ेगा, इससे हम एक समझदार व्यक्ति बन सकते हैं, इससे हमारा विकास होगा और इससे हमारी नॉलेज बढ़ेगी। और जो हमारे माता पिता सोचते हैं कि वो सोचते हैं हमारा बच्चा एक समझदार इंसान बने, एक महान बने, हमारा नाम रोशन करे और उसके जीवन में विकास हो, वो जीवन में बहुत तरक्की करे। एक अच्छी जगह पर भेजने में कभी माता पिता मना नहीं करते और वह चाहते हैं कि हमारा बच्चा अच्छी जगह जाए।
They should all be involved. Researchers must honestly involve kids in all stages of research about kids.
Bom, algo que eu acho que já devem pensar logo de cara quando convidam é que além de isso ser bom para nós, porque vai estar ajudando a saber como de algum fator que seja importante até pra gente, isso está ajudando médicos a saberem sobre o equipamento que criaram, se ele está funcionando bem. Então isso é bom até para outras pessoas que não participaram da entrevista, mas que futuramente podem usar. Então eu acho que várias pessoas devem ter pensado nisso na hora de fazer. Pode ter outros fatores.
Some parents and guardians think that clinical trials are harmful to their children. They have to know that clinical trials are meant for their own benefit.
They need to just make sure that the parent feels safe and feels secure that they can allow their child to participate in this trial. I know that for me, being a teenager, that I have a different perspective on clinical trials and just I'm less fearful of them and more wanting to participate for hope in the future. But I have 3 younger siblings, and I know if I brought up, hey, would you want to participate in a clinical trial? Each one of them would have a different perspective because they're all different ages. They're 7, 10, and 14. So they're all going to have a different perspective on clinical trial. And some are going to be more fearful, some are going to be more hopeful and more like, yeah, I want to be involved. So I think clinical researchers need to be aware of how children of different ages will respond and view clinical trials. And so I think just being aware of that is really helpful and will really be successful in the long run.
Thank you so much for showing that. Again, really a nice way to remind us why we do the work that we do. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to our colleague, Professor Pek Young Chia. She comes to us as a professor of global health and a bioethicist at the University of Oxford, and she's speaking to us today from Thailand. And Pek Young, I will turn it over to you, and many, many thanks for being here and presenting us with this keynote.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm glad to be here. So hello, everyone. My talk today is about consent and assent in pediatric research, but I will focus on global health research as well as research in low-income settings. I'll map out the challenges related to consent and assent, including specific challenges in low-income setting. Next slide, please. So a little bit about where I'm based and where about my unit here in Thailand. So we are part of University of Oxford and we collaborate closely with a Thai university called Mahidol University. We're co-funded by the Wellcome Trust. Bangkok is our hub, it's where I'm based, but we conduct clinical research internationally, including pediatric research. Our focus is tropical medicine, malaria, antimicrobial resistance, maternal and child health, and now COVID-19 as well. So we conduct a lot of research in which is including trials and non-trials or observational studies. And this talk is about our experience in the field, my own as well as my colleagues, some ethics reflections, and some qualitative research. So we work in rural communities with populations of low literacy, and we are essentially a lot funded by charities, and we use quite a lot of generic drugs rather than new drugs. So this is just a little bit about where I'm coming from. So conducting research in these settings is really challenging. There is often a lack of basic infrastructure, difficulty assessing adequate or even basic care, with the low levels of education, high levels of illiteracy, poverty, and a high prevalence of disease of poverty. But research with children in such settings is really desperately needed and not the focus of, let's say, pharmaceutical companies. Next slide, please. So this slide is just an example of an ongoing trial. You can see the scale of it. It involves research with children, and we're recruiting more than 4,000 patients with severe malaria in these parts of these countries shown on the slide. Next slide, please. So we know that children need evidence-based medical care. Lisa has mapped out in her talk, and we know that children are not little adults. We can't always extrapolate results from children from adult studies. Routine means we don't always give them the best medical care. So there's a current shift on thinking and researchers and ethicists are now rethinking the concept of vulnerability. We should protect children through research and not from research. And here we're talking about good quality ethical research, well thought through. Next slide, please. So this is just to remind everyone what is consent. We all know it. But as a reminder, here is one definition: a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular trial or research after being informed of all aspects of the trial or research that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate. So this is for competent subjects. Next slide, please. And Assent. So most established international or pediatric guidelines require Assent to be sought from children for participation in research. This is in addition to seeking parental consent. For example, the US Code of Federal Regulations say the IRB must determine that adequate provisions are made for soliciting the assent of children. And another example is when a potential subject who is deemed incapable of giving informed consent is able to give assent to decisions about participation in research, the physician must seek that assent in addition to a consent of legally accepted representative. Next slide, please. But why should assent be sought? What are the reasons? Well, there are ethical reasons, respect for persons, respect for emerging autonomy of a child. There are pedagogical reasons as well. We want to teach the child to make decisions. Children have a capacity for preference. And a child is a rights holder and active agent in assent process. Next slide, please. Of course, there are also instrumental reasons. We want to get cooperation from a child. And they have their own worries. They are different from adults. It could be related to missing school. They don't want to miss school because they want to see their friends or they want to attend classes. They have other problems. They may be afraid of needles, etc. So they have their reasons and their own fears. Next, please. But as you know, there are many challenges related to assent, and I'll spend the next few slides explaining or outlining them. Next, please. Well, the very first challenge is, what does assent mean? Have a look at this table and the underlined sections. It says assent means affirmative agreement, knowing agreement, active agreement, acquiescence. Next slide, please. If a child is deemed incompetent and therefore unable to consent to participate in the study, how is that he or she can provide affirmative agreement or acquiescence? Next slide, please. The next question is, how much information to give a child? Here is an example taken from the SIOM's guidelines. The agreement or assent of a child or adolescent has been obtained in keeping with the child or adolescents after having provided with adequate information about the research tailored to the child or adolescent's level of maturity. We know that there is a spectrum of capacity to understand. This is difficult to determine, and we need a battery of tests to determine that. Next, please. And the next question is, when should assent be sought? This leads me to a question: who is a child? Generally, a child is from a baby to the age of majority. And this differs from country to country. The question of when to seek assent varies from country to country quite wildly, actually. Many countries have a cutoff of 7 years old for assent and 18 years for informed consent. Some younger, for example, 16 years old in the UK. And we all know that children do not magically become adults at 16 or 18, which is the official cutoff, depending on the country. And some children below 18 can consent for themselves. They are mature enough. Next slide, please. So, okay, we have asked the question, who is a child? Now, who is the parent? Or the definition of a parent in the regulations. But the question is, who should provide the proxy consent on behalf of a child? So when recruiting a child into research, the child provides the assent, a parent must provide the consent. See this guideline as an example. So we have seen this before, but now let's look at the second part of the paragraph. Okay, when a potential research subject who's deemed incapable of giving informed consent is able to give assent to decisions about participation in research, the physician must seek that assent in addition to consent of the legally authorized representative. Note the word legally authorized representative. Next slide, please. So in the 2013 Declaration of Helsinki, as we've just seen, the term is legally authorized representative. As you can see in this list here, there's a wide range of terms used. An earlier version of Declaration of Helsinki used the term responsible relative, and now it's legally authorized representative. In the ICS GCP, it's legally accepted representative. And there's others as used as well as legal guardian, parent, representative, etc. And these words have varying levels of legal authority, some permission, authorization, or informed consent. Next slide, please. So who is this person? So in the guidelines too, there's deference given to application to laws in the country. This is very challenging for low and middle income countries because very often there are no specific laws on pediatric clinical research. For example, in Thailand, where I am, and in Zimbabwe too, and I'm sure in many other places. But this usually means biological parent or guardian. And in low-income settings, this is really challenging for many reasons. Next slide, please. So in Thailand, there are many, in other places where I work, there are many intergeneration households, and grandparents take on caring responsibilities for the child. Many parents work in cities and children are looked after by their grandparents, but they're not the legal representative or legally authorized representative because the parents are still alive. They're just working in another city. And of course, we have a whole range of other issues, orphans, children of minor parents. Parents who are below 18 themselves. Children of parents without legal status, and those without parental care. So this leads to presumptive exclusion of children from clinical research. Next slide, please. More challenges in low-income settings. A lot of times, local guidelines for pediatric research is not clear or non-existent. In Thailand, where I am, there are no specific guidelines on pediatric research. In the webinar yesterday, I think a lady from Pakistan said, the speaker from Pakistan said there's no pediatric guidelines in Pakistan. There are also inexperienced personnel conducting clinical research. There's very little experience conducting research, and of course, pediatric research is even less. And a lot of hospitals and resource staff, they need to cope with everyday clinical care and getting Assent with all the requirements and tailoring the information to a particular child and the parent is really difficult and takes a lot of time. Next slide, please. There's generally a lower level of formal education, lower level literacy and health literacy from both their parents and children. The community is not familiar with research and consent and not familiar at all with Assent. The community is not familiar with signing a document. So signing a consent form is already scary enough, and getting a child to sign an Assent form is even worse. So children never sign anything. And I say this because, even our laws in Thailand, they ask children to sign an Assent form from 7 onwards. And while that's okay in cities, in children in rural settings, it's really difficult. Sometimes the IRB lets us or let researchers use verbal consent. Next slide, please. So the other thing is children do not formally assent for their own medical care. So it would be a different thing in research if you ask then a child to sign an assent form. And sometimes, there's more parental control because this is Asia, where I am, but actually sometimes less because children here, depending on the setting, they take on more adult responsibilities. And a doctor in Cambodia once told me, you may appear to insult the parent if the parent has already decided, and now you go ask the child whether he wants to join a research study or not. Next slide, please. And this is an interesting one. These children may be cleverer than their parents because they're more exposed. They may know more about research because they're on social media, they are more connected these days. And of course, some older children, as I mentioned, they may actually take on adult responsibilities and adult decisions in their day-to-day life and can consent for themselves. Next slide, please. So when can children or should children consent in their own right? So this is my take. They have to be competent, which means they have to have ability to understand and retain the relevant information, to weigh the relevant information and judge the relative merits and options, and to make and communicate a decision to the researcher. Maturity is also a prerequisite for making decisions that are more significant in their consequences. And I'm talking about things that involve substantial changes into a person's life prospects or where the decision may have irreversible effects. Of course, a great deal will depend on the nature of the study. A simple survey about, let's say, eating habits, which is one-off, versus a clinical trial, which is 6 months commitment and lots of procedures. These are two different types of decisions. Next slide, please. So like a true bioethicist, I've raised many questions related and issues related to Assent, and many of these will remain unresolved, unfortunately. But there has been some developments. Next, please. So I mentioned this report just now. This report identifies 3 distinct paradigm cases, situations in which a child or young person's potential for input into a decision about research raises distinct ethical questions. So they've divided children into 3 cases, or 3 according to their ability about cognitive ability, case 1, case 2, and 3. So if we look carefully, case 1, these are babies, children who are not able to contribute their own view as to whether they should take part in research, such as babies and very young children. So here, you can't expect a child to give their opinion, but they can react, they can show fear. Case 2, these are children who are able to form views and wishes. So here we ask them for assent. Okay. Case 3, these are children and young people who potentially have the intellectual capacity and maturity to make their own decisions, but who are still considered minors in their domestic legal system. So these children can consent for themselves. And perhaps parent, whoever they may be in the legal system, can co-consent. Or in certain cases, they can consent for their own in their own right. Next slide, please. Last but not least, I'd like to mention again, this is very some initiatives that have been talked about in the last sessions. I'd like to acknowledge there are many research groups who engage and consult youth advisory groups. In the last webinar organized by MRC, we talked about some of these work. And ICANN is a good example of a network. So we can get their advice on how to obtain assent from children, how much information to provide, how to communicate research concepts, etc. Next slide, please. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce you to this excellent group in Cambodia. This is in rural Cambodia. We seek their input on our malaria research in Simpang, Cambodia. They have also helped the local research center with COVID information campaigns in schools during the height of COVID. And governor of Simpang personally requests their help to help with COVID information campaigns. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide showing a research site in Cambodia where the youth group is helping and our friends there. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Pek Young, for that fantastic foundation to understanding assent and consent, and in particular in the areas where you have a lot of experience conducting trials. And I wonder if there are questions from either the other panelists or any of the participants that we can share with you at this time.
I think Steve has one, and then I'll go.
Yeah, I would love to ask a question. Thanks so much, Dr. Chia, for that wonderful talk. You showed an image of the network that you lead or you're involved in leadership of, and the many places around the world where you run trials. And that's obviously a great diversity of places where you run those trials. And I'm curious, often centrally, model guidance or model assent forms or model sort of procedures for seeking assent or consent or other aspects of a trial conduct are put out centrally, and then they may be adapted for the requirements of local sites, local cultures. But I'm curious how you approach the challenge of putting out assent materials or recommendations for assent procedures centrally, knowing that they may be modified in the various places where your trials are being run.
So often the central team will create a set of documents, the adult information sheet and the child information sheet and the parent information sheet, and that's a central set, and then the site are free to adapt as according to their local regulations and local guidelines. So in some countries, some ethics committees rather, they have their own templates, so they have to follow their own templates. And then of course, the local guidelines take precedence. It takes priority, of course. So it's adapted to their own guidelines. And as in many countries, they don't have their own guidelines, but where they do, they would adapt the materials. And it's just usually, as long as if we adhere to the main principles of, let's say, Declaration of Helsinki, but making sure that we tick the minimum kind of boxes, because sometimes they have to drop certain things. We have to negotiate, for example, the data protection stuff. There's a whole big paragraph about data protection, and it's already taken 2 pages after translation. So we have to drop that sometimes because it's too much. So that there's a negotiation with all sides, and it is really a lot of emails and paperwork trying to get the right form for the local use in these big clinical trials. Thank you for the question. Very, very important.
So let me ask on behalf of someone who put the question in the chat, Dr. Wharton, is there a concern about monetary incentives for the clinical trial that could sway parents to consent on behalf of their children?
Oh gosh, this is a potential issue. However, I would like to say that we have thought about this quite a lot, and so there's a big range. Sometimes we do not give any monetary compensation, and sometimes we give quite a large amount. And the reasons are that when you don't give anything, it is because they come as part of routine clinical care, and the intervention or it's minimal. Okay, so and then if they travel a long distance, paying lots of money and waste and not go to work for that day, then of course we pay them in accordance to their daily wages or a little bit more to compensate for a little bit extra. So there's a range. And what I want to stress is the difference between due and undue inducement. Sometimes you really have to give people compensation because that's only fair. But it becomes a problem when it's undue inducement, which means the reward is too much to turn down your offer. And whether or not it's a child, as a parent of a child or the patient himself or herself, this is a difficult discussion. And usually we go by the local ethics committee or the local advisory board to tell us what is a good amount to pay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lisa?
Thank you for that. And I just would like to pose one final question that was just put into the Q&A from an anonymous attendee, which is, how would you best handle cases where the assent and consent differ? For example, when a child wants to participate in the study, but the legal representative or parent does not agree, or vice versa. So, the adult consents and the child does not want to assent. Thank you.
That's a very good question. It is, well, usually the best case scenario is the researcher will talk to both parent and child until they both agree on either let's go for it or not. Unfortunately, we always have to go with the parent in most of the places we work in. So that is the default. That's the default. But when a problem we encounter quite often is when the parents say, yeah, go ahead, because they listen to they want to please the doctor, if you like, and the child doesn't say anything because it's not so much in the culture of places for child to voice an objection. So, but you can see the child is scared, and in that scenario, that usually the doctor won't or the researcher won't recruit the participant. But I can't say for, because as you said, as I mentioned, we have multiple sites and how they do it at each site differs.
So I just want to ask one follow-up question to that. Do you think about the necessity of assent differently when there's direct benefit to the child or not? And what's your recommendation? It sounds like you always or really do ask the parents first. So if they say no, you don't approach the child, but how do you sort of unpack that in the various settings in which you work?
Yeah, so you're asking about so that there are two different types of research.
That's right.
One with direct benefit and one with no direct benefit, right? Yeah. I don't think there's a difference in terms of, there is a difference, but in terms of seeking assent and consent, we don't make a distinction. Of course, when there's no direct benefit to the child himself or herself, but in any case, whether there's a direct benefit or not, if somebody is unhappy, either party is unhappy, we don't persuade them to participate. And one reason, Barbara, is that we hardly, that's because of my experience, we hardly have research where it's in a very new clinical trial at say oncology patients where this is the only chance you'll get the medication. Usually our trials are in malaria. If you don't participate in the trial, we'll give you routine clinical care, which is fine as well. So there's not that pressure as well.
Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you so much for really giving us some insight into your experience, your workings, and really laying the foundation for the panel that I'm delighted to shift to at this time. There is another question in the chat, but I'm going to suggest we hold off until we've heard from other participants to allow for, of course, you, Pek Young, and others to answer. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Joffe. He is a pediatric oncologist. He is a bioethicist. He is currently the Art and Eileen Penn Professor of Medical Ethics and Health Policy and Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine, where he is the chair in his Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy and Chief of the Division of Medical Ethics. So with that, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to give your opening remarks, introduce your panel, and take us away with this discussion. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks again, Dr. Chia, for that wonderful talk, which I think laid a perfect foundation for where we're going to go in this panel. Kristen, next slide. And actually next one and next one. So I'm obviously based and have trained and practiced in the United States. And I want to start by just sharing, and Dr. Chia already shared some of this language with you, the language that we operate under in the United States, and talk then about some of the sort of principles that are embedded in this and their potential implications and the challenges of sort of putting them into force around the world. So in our regulations, and you've seen this, the IRB, our regulations define assent, and say the IRB shall determine that adequate provisions are made for soliciting the assent of the children when, in the judgment of the IRB, the children are capable of providing assent. And next slide. And by definition in our regulations, assent means a child's affirmative agreement to participate in research. Again, still reading from the regulations, mere failure to object should not, absent affirmative agreement, be construed as assent. I want to just say a couple of things about this. First of all, there is, as opposed to some other places in the world, there is no minimum age in our federal regulations. Some people think that there's a minimum age of 7 in the United States, and some IRBs put that into practice, but in fact, there is no minimum age written into our federal regulations. Secondly, this language about children's capability, or when children are capable of providing assent, our regulations provide us with very vague guidance about that. And third, and this gets actually the question that Barbara asked earlier, the IRB has the ability to waive the requirement for assent in some trials where there's a prospect of direct benefit that can't be obtained elsewhere, although there's no clarity about what sorts of settings or trials that might be. So IRBs and researchers struggle with that. Next slide. Now, some of the principles that are in these regulations are also accepted worldwide. This is ICH E11, International Council for Harmonization, Guidance E11, Ethical Principles for Research Involving Children, most recent revision in 2017. And it's been adopted in numerous jurisdictions or countries around the world. So next slide, Kristen. So somehow when these slides got put together, all the dots moved, all the stars moved. This was intended to show where the ICH regulations or guidelines have been adopted, but the stars should be there for Brazil, Canada, China, Chinese Taipei, Europe as a whole, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Switzerland, and the United States. So obviously not all jurisdictions around the world have adopted these guidelines, but many influential jurisdictions have. Next slide. And so some of the language from E11 that we should be familiar with. As a rule, a pediatric subject is legally unable to provide informed consent. They may be psychologically or ethically able, but they're legally unable. Therefore, pediatric study participants are dependent on their parents or legal guardian to assume responsibility for their participation in trials. Fully informed consent should be obtained from the legal guardian in accordance with regional laws or regulations. So this gets to the guardian or parent component of permission that Dr. Chia talked about. Next slide. The language also says all participants should be informed to the fullest extent possible about the study in language and terms they are able to understand. And I presume this means including child participants in pediatric research. Next slide. Next, sorry, Nick, I think that one went back. Next.
Back.
And, oop.
I think you go back to. because I think we skipped one. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Where appropriate, participants, and this is child participants, should assent to enroll in a study. Age of assent to be determined by the IRBs or ethics committees or be consistent with local legal requirements. So here in this broadly accepted international guidance, there's an expectation that participants should assent where appropriate, although without definition of where exactly that is appropriate. Next. As a rule, a pediatric subject is legally unable to provide informed consent. Therefore, pediatric study participants are dependent on their parents or legal guardian to assume responsibility for their participation in clinical studies. Fully informed consent should be obtained from a legal guardian in accordance with regional laws and regulations. I'm afraid my slides have actually got mixed up in order here. Next one. Participants, and this is thinking about older children, participants of appropriate intellectual maturity should personally sign and date either a separately designed written assent form or the written informed consent. So a concept that older children who are more mature may have the ethical, though not legal ability to agree to a trial should be able to actually sign something. Next. In all cases, participants should be made aware of their rights to decline to participate or to withdraw from the study at any time. And next. So there are several problems with these requirements. The first is that my experience practicing pediatric oncology and working primarily in a Western culture in the United States is that even in our culture with guidances that were written with Western culture in mind, the assent requirement is problematic. So it raises the questions of when should kids be able to overrule their parents? Dr. Chia talked about settings in which it might be perceived as disrespectful of the parent for the kid to be asked for their separate permission. And we experience that in our practice as well. And then how should age, how should maturity, how should the complexity of the study, whether it's a relatively simple study, a one-time interaction, a one-time blood draw, or a much more protracted, complex clinical trial, how should the seriousness of the disease, how should the potential for benefit, how should all of these things affect the role that children play in decisions? And we have not worked all of these things out, even in our local experience here in the United States. Next. It's also, I think, important that the requirement to obtain assent may be a Western-centered requirement and may not be respectful of or may conflict with the very diverse cultural and family norms that we see both in our diverse culture within countries like the United States and then in very diverse cultures and settings across the world. And so to have a view that there's one way or one very narrow way, range of ways to include or to enroll children in research may actually be disrespectful of the diversity of cultures that we find across the world. And next slide. We also finally know little about how the requirement to obtain assent is actually followed in practice, whether here in the United States or other Western countries, where there's actually not a lot of research about what the actual practice of seeking assent from kids is like. And then equally so across the world in diverse cultures, diverse settings, diverse countries across the world, how does this actually play out in practice? And it's really to this last question that we are looking to the expertise of our panelists to help us understand in a range of cultures, in a range of countries, in a range of legal and regulatory environments, how kids are involved or how investigators and clinicians seek to involve children in decisions about research. And that's what we'll be looking forward to hear from our panelists and what we hope to have a discussion about. So next slide, I think that's my last one. I want to thank you for giving me a few minutes to introduce the panel. Now I want to turn it over to Dr. Jojo Mentoring from the University of the Philippines, pediatrician and chair of the Department of Clinical Epidemiology at the University of the Philippines. Dr. Mentoring, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone, or evening, wherever it is in the world you are. First of all, thank you to the organizers for the invitation to share insights regarding the assent and consent in the field, particularly in the Philippine setting. Thank you, Lisa. It is such a pleasure and privilege to be working with you and such a passionate group. And thank you, Fai Kyong and Steve, for the discussion that provides plenty of context for my talk. My disclaimer is that there are no articles to date that discuss Assent issues. Can I have the first slide, please? So there are no articles to date that discuss Assent issues in the Philippine context, and the insights that I will be sharing are mainly my own. In fact, in preparing for this talk, I now believe that this would make a great article that would be definitely appreciated by an international audience. So next slide, please. So as you can see, the Philippines is an archipelago composed of 7,100 islands with 3 main island groups, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, that are colored in this map with the colors of the Philippine flag. So Luzon is the blue area, Visayas is the yellow area, and Mindanao is the red area. So they're all island groups. There are many distinct cultures with a lot of similarities, but also differences. In fact, we have registered about 111 dialects. And so I guess you can say that the Philippines are diverse. But of course, with diversity, there is still unity. The Philippines has been under the Spanish rule for more than 300 years, from the 1500s to the 1800s, explaining why in the whole Asian region, we are the only predominantly Christian nation. And I guess we inherited from Spain a strong sense of family and religion. Our population is over 100,000, distributed inequitably into 17 regions, and the most being concentrated in Luzon and the National Capital Region. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And this slide shows that the Philippine population is predominantly young, majority of which are less than 19. So Assent issues are particularly important because our population characteristics. And I believe, in fact, that more and more trials that involve children and young adults are now being conducted in the Philippines to take advantage of our young population. Okay, so next slide, please. So this slide actually summarizes some of the characteristics embedded in Filipino culture that have been considered because they strongly influence Assent issues. So I would just like to say there are many more Filipino values, but I cannot fit them into one slide, or I cannot discuss them at length within the time frame that I was given. So the most important is being family-oriented. Among Filipinos, it's not unusual to see large and extended families celebrating or going on outings together, or even having dinner together or traveling with each other, even if the children are predominantly young adults. We also express respect for elders. We express profound respect for elders. In my own extended family, we always spend Sundays in my mother's house. My mother is 95 years old and stays with my 2 sisters. And we spend the afternoon in prayer, we have dinner, we say goodbye, we go to our own homes, and we do the same thing over and over every Sunday. We are God-fearing, generally hospitable, never hesitating to invite visitors into our house. And there's an attribute called utang na loob, no? Which literally translated means debt of gratitude. But I'm not sure if that translation was able to do justice to what it represents. But that debt of gratitude makes people beholden to others who have somehow or another contributed to their welfare. For example, if I got a job through someone, I have an utang na loob, or a debt of gratitude to that person, and that makes me almost beholden to that other person. And another trait is called bayanihan, in the second to the last bullet. This word in fact does not have an appropriate English translation that embodies the trait, but it describes how members of a community come together to help other members of the community who are in need without thoughts of the need for some form of compensation. Actually, when we say bayanihan, or if you do a Google search on bayanihan, the icon is always community members carrying a house. No? So the traditional Philippine house can be carried by several people, and it allows the house to be transferred from location to location because they're made of bamboo. And that's often the picture depicted in when you look for the term bayanihan in the Philippine context. So lastly, the Philippines are described as expressive of love and happiness. And now, how do these attributes translate into assent issues? We all know that assent is the process. The assent process is an application of the ethical principle of respect for a person's autonomy. In this case, it's the child's autonomy, especially if the child is mature enough to make decisions that would directly affect his own or her own welfare. In my experience, a child or even a young adult would still defer their decision to their parents or elders. And when I say elders, this could be grandparents, uncles, aunts, or older sibs. There's a phenomenon right now in the Philippines where there are a lot of overseas Filipino workers. And so children are sometimes relegated to the care of the grandparents or to an uncle or an older sib. And children or even young adults, and I say young adults because they can be 18, but they still will respect the opinions of the elders. So very often, whether it's for research or treatment, family conferences are called, whether formally or informally, that often involve extended family. Next slide, please. So the factors affecting assent issues in the Philippines, of course, as with other international factors, maturity, neurodevelopment, but very strongly family factors. Family factors aside from independence and perceptions of self. Family factors are perhaps one of the most important issues that will influence the assent process. And only after parents and elders contribute their opinions will the assenting child or consenting younger adult make their decision. And it can be observed that no matter how mature or independent one is, the parents' decisions will more often than not prevail. And we as researchers and investigators actually have no choice but to respect the decision of the research participant. So I think that's my last slide. So thanks very much for allowing me to contribute to this very important webinar. And I look forward to further participation in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Munter. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Erwin Koo, who's currently a fellow in the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School, but also a pediatrician who's head of the pediatrics department at the International Medical University in Malaysia. Dr. Koo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. A huge thanks to the committee for this invitation as well. I'm very humbled to be part of this panel and series to advance global pediatric clinical trials. So I'm from Malaysia. Next slide, please. So just Malaysia is a Southeast Asian country. And if you have been in Malaysia, you would have realized that the dynamics of the Malaysian society relies on a very rich but conservative culture with an underlying social hierarchy. Next slide, please. This is my only slides, actually, giving an overview of the perspective of assent from Malaysia. As mentioned by the keynote speaker and Jojo in the Philippines, children's rights and interests are viewed as inseparable from their parents, and that in many Asian countries, in fact, children should be seen and not heard, isn't it? In fact, it is very true, I think not just in Cambodia, of what Pek Yong had said earlier, seeking assent from a child may be culturally inappropriate and in fact even insulting, especially so if parents have given their permission. A child's dissent may result in guilt, resentment, and interfamilial conflict as well. But I think I feel that seeking assent is itself a recognition of a children's developing autonomy, and it is a good pedagogical tool as an educational tool as well. And that itself is sufficiently important that assent should be required, even in Asian countries like Malaysia and Philippines. So I believe that the process of seeking assent should, however, be modified to different cultural contexts. For example, whether children's assent or parents' permission is sought first may depend on what Jojo has said, depends on cultural norms. In Malaysia, the family may take priority over a child's self-autonomy, and hence family facilitated and collective decision-making becomes a neutral consequences of this requirement or this social structure. So I feel this perception of Ubuntu ethics conceptualizes the fundamental human rights in the context of communal rights, and that decision-making is conceived to be a collective process rather than an individualistic one. So as an overview, involvement of underprivileged children or underprivileged minors as research subjects in a conservative society such as in Malaysia remains a challenge that needs a cultural humility, proper assent practices, independent review boards, and awareness of the minor's best interests and of any risk of maleficence. So the challenge here is that assent is not just a form, I think. It is a dialogue between the researcher and the potential subjects or participant or child participant. And I think additional time is needed to address cultural and economic differences. I think one of the questions that was posed earlier was the incentives and how it can lead to coercion, especially when the subjects are of financially disadvantaged community. So this all needs time and to address, and perhaps we can augment research professionals' awareness and promote children's participation in the decision-making process, whether they should be enrolled in the trial or not. So I think this partnership, this dialogue is a process and not an end in itself. The key to these dialogues lies in the practice of listening actively to the feedback of the child-parent unit while embracing the feelings and thoughts of the child's decision-making process. So with that, Steve, this is my overview from Malaysia, a perspective from Malaysia on regarding assent. Happy to answer any of your questions that the panel, that the audience have later. Thank you, Steve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Koo. And I think we'll have a number of questions after all of the panelists have had a chance to speak. So we will certainly be coming back to you. Next up, we have Dr. Sungmin Han, who is a pediatric hematologist oncologist at the Yonsei Cancer Center at Severance Hospital. Dr. Han, floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, good morning and good evening. I'm a pediatrician from Seoul. Thank you for the organizers for having me in this rare and precious discussion. Next slide, please. I'm glad to share Korean perspective and circumstances regarding clinical research for children. Next slide, please. In Korea, there is a law named Rules Regarding the Safety of Medicines, and under the law, informed consent is mandatory for approval or running of clinical trials in Korea. And also content of the consent form is stipulated by law. And also education about subject consent and understanding of recruitment process is regulated by law. And proper education must be provided for investigators for conducting clinical trials. Next, please. And Assent is for subjects who are lack of understanding, expression their own weaknesses. We all learned about it before. And for children, usually parents are deputies for them. And there is no law but guidelines or recommendations for clinical trials in Korea by Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. In the guideline, it says children are considered as vulnerable subjects, and age under 19 years old are considered legally children in Korea. So for 7 years old or older, consent of the children are also recommended besides the assent of their parents. Next, please. In the recommendation, it says also special measures are needed to protect the rights and interests of pediatric research participants and to protect them from serious risks. And children should have benefit from their clinical research. However, the problem is in the clinical trial setting, often we don't know for sure what is a real benefit to children. And there can be different adverse events in pediatric population. So I think often investigators or researchers or doctors' decision is very critical. Next, please. In Korea, parents' trust and loyalty to medical staff is very high. I think it is related to parents' passion and devotion to their children. And most parents seek best doctors and treatments nationwide. So doctors and parents together can discuss what is the best option for their child or patient. However, usually the final decision rests to the doctor. And often, I think children or adolescents' own opinion is not considered. So again, doctors' opinions is always the first line. Next, please. So I think investigators' role are very important in conducting clinical trials for children. Investigators should try to exclude their own prejudice, which affects the study design or clinical trial performance. And they should have balanced views of risks and benefits of performing the study. So the investigators should be very professional, and they should be their ethical views are very important. However, in real, I think there is still lack of educations and programs focusing on ethical issues in pediatric clinical trials. And moreover, investigators are usually very busy. They have lots of works. They are heavily loaded with lots of work, so they cannot just focus on clinical trials. Next, please. So I think we all know the importance of consent and assent in pediatric clinical research. However, more meticulous guidelines and education programs, especially for investigators, are really required. Okay, this is all for my talk, and I'm looking forward for further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Han. And finally, before we move into the discussion, we have Dr. Wanting Cho, who's an associate medical director at PPD, which is a large international clinical research organization, but also has a background as a pediatrician and a PhD in epidemiology, and I believe now works in Tokyo. Dr. Cho.
Thank you, Steve. I'm looking at myself. Okay. So, Steve, can you hear me? I'm not sure. Is my voice loud enough?
It's perfect.
We can hear you, yes.
Thank you. Actually, this is my only slide. And what I want to is echo every topic from Park Young and Jojo and Dr. Han and everyone that actually, yes, we have a lot of challenge and everything happens in the real setting. is always not satisfying what we are having from the guideline. So, but we don't forget that we really have a local network support. I think in every country, some people are already just like us, start to work on this topic that Assent is very important. And for investigator, for the research participants, for everyone, if we can have a general support, for example, some new study site or some team never have experience how to help the team to create Assent, or they even don't know what is the actual guidance for the age differences, or they don't really understand the concept. I think there will be wonderful if there is a local network, country level network, so you can save a lot of time. You don't have to prepare the document from the beginning. And this is what I want to introduce the Pediatric Clinical Trial Network in Japan. We actually is not a very long history organization, but there is a lot of enthusiastic staff working there. So they develop a very well organized, validated template, not including a general template. They already create detail. For example, for about 40 or 50 different kind of examination. So how can you explain the blood sampling, the pulmonary function test, or ECG to an elementary school student? So, and for teenager, how do you explain you have to avoid to be pregnant? So this is very important topic. So I think in one country, they can have a general understanding and guidance. So if you reach out for that network supporting, there must be someone can share necessary information. So this was I work for is a support and the bridging position for the frontline investigator, just like Dr. Han and Jojo and everyone. So this is what I want to share is never forget there must be someone there willing want to help if you don't have actual understanding for that. And I want to echo another, I think there is a topic that Kyung said, that a lot of children already much more smarter than their parents, because now we are not 20 years ago, we don't, now they have internet, they have smartphone, they know what's going on in this world. So we have an interesting study in Japan that there is an ethics specialist that he really want to know when is the best timing to introduce Assent and what kind of Assent is age appropriate. So he used the study participant is her daughter, his daughter. So during a 6-year long cohort research that he found out it's about age 9 or 10 that children finally start to understand that participate into a research to helping a lot of people and to give a hope for the future. Before that, they cannot differentiate the idea of helping myself or helping a lot of people. And after age 9 or 10, they finally can reach the concept of research and the ethic or risk. Because I think this is based on the education level that just like Western country, we will have a scientific class that they have to create a group to do a scientific project. So it's a similar idea that participate in a research, whether it's observational cohort research or a clinical trial. So the point is, after an age of, for example, 10 or 11, that they don't really want to listen to their parents anymore. So not before the teenager, because they think they already get a lot of information from internet, so they want to know more. So they much more rely on who really understand what's going on. So just like Jojo or our team said, family is really important in their concept, but within themselves, they also think my parents may not know more than me. So the study team, for example, study nurse, study coordinator, or investigator, they trust more. They want to gather more information from them. So I think between the balance of, we don't want to increase a lot of burden from the study team, but we really want to make appropriate assent, not according to a regulatory or ethic, because we really want those children to participate in this large project as a participant, and they can really they can really believe they can convert a lot of effect on that. So this is a 2 point I want to share with, and I think all our teams are very experienced in trial research, and I'm really happy to have this chance to be here. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Cho. And I would now invite all of the panelists, including Dr. Chia, to come on video, and we will open the floor for discussion and questions, either from panelists all among themselves, if you have questions for each other, as well as there are some questions coming in from the audience that I will pose. But first, I want to see if anybody has any questions for each other, or comments in response to each other's remarks. Yes, Dr. Chia.
This is directed at, can be anybody, but it was based on what Jojo mentioned. So in countries where the median age is quite low, right? So in where the age of the population is lower, like Philippines, Cambodia, Thailand, do you think we should formally shift the age of adulthood, age of majority, and therefore consent? Because I'm doing bad maths in my head here. What do you think, Jojo?
Well, the age of majority is dictated by law here in the Philippines, and it's not going to be very easy to change the law. We have what they call a family code, and I think that's the law that defines what the age of majority is. In fact, the Filipinos have been very critical about some politicians wanting the age of majority to be lowered, because it might lead to a lot of well, we have a very high teenage pregnancy rate, and so and I believe that lowering that will make society more permissive, and it might even worsen the problem. The other thing, though, is that even if the age of majority is lowered, I think in Philippine culture, and now I appreciate that it's the same for Taiwan and Japan and Malaysia and Korea, it's still very centered on family. So in fact, 19-year-olds, even 20-year-olds might even end up consulting their families first before they agree to a participation in a clinical trial. Although we say that they're adult and can make decisions on their own, they always respect the opinions of their elders. I'm not sure if changing the age of majority will make it better. I think personally, I think it's going to be just the same.
I want to convey. Oh, did I interrupt somebody? I want to convey a question from Dr. Ignacio Mora, who says that he's coming from Mexico and points out that, in his words, the rest of the world is just like us in Mexico. But he raised a question, and I think, Dr. Cho, you partially responded to this in your remarks already, but interested in other people's thoughts. The issue of appropriate intellectual maturity, or some phrasing like that, which is in a lot of the guidances and regulations. How do we know when a child or a young person has appropriate intellectual maturity, and how does that intersect with issues of family relationships, family cultural norms? How do we put these things together, and what do we mean by appropriate intellectual maturity?
Yes, as a pediatrician in all of us, I think even the same age children may show different development status. So what we can do is at least we try our best. For example, in Japan or Taiwan, we do perform research to those child to observe how many to do we cannot do a qualitative research, but at least we can try to do questionnaire to understand how much this age level can reach. So just like I think Dr. Han also shared a slide that we cut in a several age group, but it's really wide. So for example, from age 6 to age 11 is already a large, huge gap here. So I think we try to do a template, but the most important is during the network also perform training to the study coordinator. We train them that during the processing of the accent, if you feel that this child cannot really catch what's going on here, you really need to downgrade at the time of the just like Dr. Ku also said, it's a dialogue, continues through whole study. So, and then sometimes I think Dr. Han knows our study may proceed 3 years or longer. So the child will grow up, they will understand more. And I think everyone knows that we can withdraw the consent during the process of the study, and the accent also can be withdrawn anytime. So age appropriate is a guidance, but I think based on each country and each age population, we can try to modify in our best status because each child matters. Yeah.
I agree. If I may contribute, we have our national ethical guidelines, and I guess we adapted the different age cutoffs from international literature. Generally, for children who are less than 7, we don't bother with trying to get assent because their intellectual maturity can't process the assent process. And then from 8 to less than 12, we do verbal assents. And then from 12 to less than 15, we have simplified written assents. And from more than 15 to less than 18, we just ask the participant to co-sign the consent that may have been signed by the parents. However, I also attended very recently a FERCAP. FERCAP is the Forum for Ethics Research Committees in the Asia-Pacific region. And one of their best practices are for children who are in the borderline, like for example, an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old. If the researcher feels that this child seems to be, though only 7, seems to be mature enough to make a decision about his own welfare, then they will proceed with the assent process, even if our guidelines say that for 7 and younger, assents are not needed. So I think that's part of best practices. But I'd like to share with the group that I'm in the process, at least in the Philippines, of trying to validate those age groups because they have never really been tested and they've just been adapted from international literature.
Yes, I echo that. I think the validation. So as a PVD clinical, we receive every sponsor, they just give us the global accent. So when we apply to each country in APAC region, actually it's mission impossible. So we really need to validate to each country specific, just like Jojo and Ku said that if we don't make this effort to be each country's lead investigator or ECIRB, they just complain. what's this? We don't understand. Why are you using this to directly to apply to us? Yeah, so it's very important.
Thanks. I think I'd like to add on what Dr. Cho and Jojo has said. In fact, I was wondering if any of the panelists have come across where, I mean, you mentioned about age where there are 7 years old, 8 years old, where there's a borderline, or in fact, even 12 years old who still find it difficult to understand what the research and clinical trials is all about. I think most of us, most of the researchers tend to just get things done over and when the child does not have the ability to provide assent, do you think that this child should not be included in the trials then? I wonder what the panelists have thoughts are in such circumstances.
Yes, if I may answer, Erwin, usually we say that research is mainly voluntary. So if there is a dissent of the child, even if the parents consent, we sort of mandate that the principal investigator will respect the decision of the child and not recruit the child to a study. So even if their parents insist, we need to respect the child. I don't know about your cultures, but in the Philippines, you know, circumcision is a cultural thing. In the Philippines, males usually have to be circumcised. And I, as a pediatrician, I come across parents who insist that their child be circumcised. For example, at when they're grade 3, about 9 years old. And I end up asking the child, do you really want to be circumcised? You know, because you can have that done at a later age. And often they say, no, it's just my father who's forcing me. You know, so I end up talking to the father and say, you know, there's nothing wrong with waiting until the child is ready. So I often intervene, but of course that's not a research setting. It's a treatment setting. But I like to use that example to illustrate that sometimes we have to respect the child's decision rather than the parent's decision.
That's very true, and even sometimes in reality, there's going to be interfamilial conflict at home, and there's going to be stress, and the dad you're going to say, why didn't you go for the circumcision? I've already told you to go for the circumcision, right?
That's right.
And here you are telling me, no, you don't want to go for the circumcision. I thought we already discussed this. Yeah, I mean, it's not that easy, but yeah, that's true, Jojo. I think I totally agree with you. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, Dr. Han.
Can I add on? Okay. I think I agree all with you, and I think we cannot define children's maturity just by age. We know that every children have too much diversity in their maturation, and their medical conditions are all different. So we all agree about that, I think. And moreover, as Dr. Koo said in your presentation, assent form is not just a form. We have to have a communication and dialogue with participants or their family, parents, and children themselves also. So I think at least we have to try to explain to the children about the study and about all the things we can according to that children's maturation status. So yeah, I think we all agree about that. And so I think the investigators' roles are very important. We have to very keen to explain to the children about the research and clinical trials. But I think it's a very large hurdle because we are very busy and we have to make extra effort to convince family and parents and also children. So yeah, investigators' roles are very tough in children's clinical trial, I think.
Can I just follow on and ask a follow-up question to this one, which is, so a child can assent and then, for a therapeutic trial, parents assent, and then you tell them that you're going to need to do a blood draw for research. They start crying, say absolutely not. Then what? Do you consider that dissent, and do you respect dissent in that way? Or what's your sort of threshold for appreciating that, there's, limits to what we can and cannot do?
I think all children dislikes blood taking. That's an obvious
I was going to
dissent.
say that.
But is that dissent?
Yeah,
or
no.
not?
Yeah, Jojo.
No, I was going to say that crying is not necessarily dissent. I have had patients, for example, who agree to procedures, but they can't help but cry because it's painful. So, and we tell them, and asking them again, I agree that assent should be a continuous dialogue and not necessarily just signing a piece of paper. So even if they're crying or just before the procedure they start to cry, you want to get the assurance that they still agree to the process, even if they're scared. I think being scared is really part of growing up and not necessarily a dissent. As a pediatrician, I have had patients, for example, who have cancer, who might need a bone marrow aspiration. And after explaining everything, they agree, of course. The parents agree. And of course, it's necessary because it's necessary to monitor treatment. And no matter how much they agree, they'll still cry, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's dissent. That's just my take on that question.
Let me follow up with a variation on this question. This comes from one of the people in our audience. How would you address the problem of the vulnerable group to express their opinion regarding withdrawals in the middle of a study? So not simply crying, but we say there's a right to withdraw, and the ICH regulations that I read talk about a right to withdraw. So how, we've talked about assent at the beginning, decisions about going into the study or into the trial or not. How do we keep that process ongoing, Jojo, in your words, with the possibility of withdrawal? And I invite anybody to comment on this important issue.
Well, in my experience, the child doesn't withdraw face to face. They just don't show up. For example, they have a scheduled follow-up or scheduled follow-up for maybe a blood draw, and they don't show up. And after several calls, they don't show up or they don't answer your call. That's when we consider them withdrawn. They hardly will come and say, I don't want to join anymore. They'll just not show up. That's my experience. I don't know about the others, but I think everyone's nodding their head.
In that situation, you may not know if it was the parents who decided not to show up or they didn't show up because of the kids' preferences or a combination of the two.
That's right. That's right.
AJ Allen asks, so in the United States, the IRB is the entity that decides whether assent is required or not, including for individual children. So the IRB might say assent is required, let's say, from everybody who's 12 and up for a particular trial. But then a particular child may come along, let's say, who has intellectual delay or some reason why they might not be typical of kids who are above 12. And in the United States, although I'm not sure that this is how things are always implemented, in theory, the investigator should come to the IRB and say, please give me an exception for this child. And the question is that how things play out in your countries? Or is there a different system when assent might be required for a class of children, but there might be a reason to make an exception for a particular child?
Maybe I can take this one just as a general comment. in many of the places we work in. Unfortunately, the IRBs or ethics committees are not brave enough to give exceptions, because a lot of ethics committees, they follow very closely guidelines. ICSGCP is like God guidelines. So, and a lot of times they refer to also the US FDA ones. And if you say that you have to get written consent or assent, you have to do it, because if you waive it, there is a risk of trouble, and there's a fear of getting into trouble. So unfortunately, that's the case. But as IRBs develop, there are some IRBs who are brave and will say, okay, this is crazy. We should waive assent or consent for this particular case, or this particular study, we don't need it. It's very rare to get that approval in my experience. I think someone else wants to add, yeah.
If I may, no, go ahead.
Carry on, Jojo. Oh, no, I just want to add on to what Prof. Chia has mentioned, and that's very true, actually. Actually, it depends a lot on the study design as well. I think the last thing we want is to take advantage of the most vulnerable population in the society, which is a child who is not able to understand what's going on, a child who is intellectually impaired, for example, or a child who's having a spectrum of autistic disorder. We have a lot of examples where a child's consent and assent to a trial depends on peer pressure. Lots of their friends go into the trials because they find it very interesting, and they succumb to peer pressure and assent to themselves. So a lot of times children, I mean, in my context or in a developing country context, do not really, I would say, even at age of 8, 9, 10, do not really understand what's going on. And it takes a lot of effort and time to tell them. I think I like what yesterday's talk was about, drawing a diagram, a cartoon, to tell them what about is the research. So it takes lots of effort from the primary investigators and their team. Yeah, Jojo?
Well, I wanted to answer the question from the point of view of an ethics committee. Being the chair of the ethics committee of our university, we don't usually give waiver of consent for exceptions. If the whole study involved the inclusion criteria were children with autism disorder, then definitely we can provide waiver of assent for that case. But if the study involved normal children and one particular child who is qualified for the studies happens to be autistic, I think that because that child cannot enter into the assent process, that child should not be included in that study. As I've said, participating in a study is a voluntary thing, and definitely the principal investigator can probably look for another just as qualified person to join that study. So it's not a grounds for asking for exception or waiver.
Yeah, I echo this topic as because my majority of research is rare disease, seizure, child. So just like Jojo said, if the general setting of this study, most of child really cannot just, because they're disease related. So it will be clearly written in the inclusion criteria or exclusion criteria. And it means that we already understand they cannot to fully understand, but still I think we will try at least that they will not be afraid of us. I think this is most important. Don't be afraid of it. Otherwise they will just not show up anymore. And for general setting, just like Dr. Hoyong said, if a general study that there is some specific mental problem or development issue that may be easily to remove from the study participant by the inclusion criteria, that because we expect that this subject may not comply to our study procedure because there's a lot of difficulty for him to understand, to follow. And just like you say, he may not just don't show up, just like escape from school, just like escape from kindergarten, just like that. Yeah. So it's I think it's very useful tool to interpret at least this part. So to ECRRB, we never challenge them. We say, "Oh, give us a waiver," because in the future it means you are going to make some trouble for your own future. So nobody will do that. Yeah.
So can I just take a countering view for a minute, which is that if, autism, for instance, in this example, is not an exclusion criteria, then it seems to me that one should be enrolling that child. And if an exception is appropriate because they, despite their age, cannot understand or intellectual disability or whatever, that's an appropriate exception. And if we start deciding when people who would be eligible can and cannot be part of a trial, even, presuming they meet eligibility criteria, then we're really impacting the generalizability of the knowledge, and we're, weighing protectionism over inclusion, which has its own problems. So how do you counter that argument?
If that argument is included as part of the rationale for doing the study, then of course we won't start. If, for example, the principal investigator states that they will be including as part of the recruitment strategy people with disabilities, then of course there will have to be waiver of consent and assent for those subgroup of people, and in which case the legally accepted representative or the parent may serve as the most appropriate to provide consent for such inclusion.
And I would argue further that, instead of saying the burden is on the investigator to say we will include people with disability, that we should be asking investigators who say they won't, why not?
I don't have a very good counter argument to that, but I'm just thinking of what's in my mind. I think this is where the IRBs or ethical review or community advisory boards comes in. I think it's very important for independent child advocates, for example, to determine whether the study are appropriate or are open to all participants regardless of their disability. I think if the study is otherwise ethical, I think the study should not lead parents to assume unreasonable risk for their child that outweighs the child's interest.
Absolutely.
I think that's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my counter to your counter is that if you do allow the inclusion of people who are unable to enter into the consent or assent, then they may take advantage of this vulnerable population to complete their studies, which will not be generalizable.
So
imagine if the inclusion is supposed to be the general population, and then they find that here's a loophole. If we recruit autistic people, we don't need their assent, and they start now recruiting a lot of autistic people to get around the assent principle, then that's also counterproductive and may not reach generalizable results. So that's my counter to your counter.
So I have a counter to your counter to my counter, but I'm not going to go there.
I understand. I understand the argument, and
yes,
of course this should be taken.
And there's
case
still
to case.
consent, right?
Right.
The question is whether there's assent as well.
I have to ask one last very, very sort of big and global question. And I actually want to start with Dr. Han, because several of you made arguments that the priority in like the reality on the ground will go to the investigator or the physician or to the family, the extended family, the elders in the family. And it left me wondering whether this kind of global norm that we've set out, and for example, in ICH GCP, this sort of broad principle of expectation that assent and affirmative agreement be sought from the child, whether that fits with the reality in the settings in which you all are working and have experience. I almost had the sense that there was not a good fit between these norms that have been set out and the realities on the ground of we look to the family, we look to the parents, we look to the grandparents, we look to the doctors to help us make these decisions. And only after that do we somehow engage the children in these discussions. So Dr. Han, I want to start with you because you emphasized the role of the physician in Korean culture, but should we even have a kind of global norm of assent the way it's set out in some of our regulations and guidances?
I think we still need a norm, of course, and that's the respect of children's autonomy or opinion, I think. So I think although we all have difficulties and obstacles of clinical trials involving children, but we should have a norm, I think, and we should have a guideline based on certain respect for children. So I think it's very important that we all have this discussion and we think about what is the norm for all of us. And it's very hard, again, I think, for the investigators and alone can decide. It's very difficult. So I think we mentioned before, but IRB's role are also important, very important. We have to lean to the decision of IRB, and their roles are also important. And yeah, this is all I can say. Thank you.
Barbara, I think you're muted.
I just wanted to ask if others wanted to respond to that. Should there be a norm, and how strictly should we enforce that norm? Should we do trials in countries where culturally or otherwise there's no expectation of assent?
Well, in my opinion, I guess taking off from your previous question, if you systematically exclude a country because of difficulty of assent, then wouldn't that be an injustice? Wouldn't you be disenfranchising that particular culture? So I don't think that you should exclude countries because of difficulties of assent. I think the reason why we are having this webinar is that because although there are international norms, there may be cultural or country-specific exceptions or considerations. For example, in the United States, I know that there's what they call the emancipated minor. There's no such thing in the Philippines. There's no such thing as an emancipated minor. And so all minors really will require some form of parental consent. But in the United States, there may be youth who, after finishing, for example, high school, decide to take jobs and separate from their parents. And even if they are less than 18, they assume the role of being responsible for their own welfare. And perhaps that's a cultural exception.
What about minor parents consenting for their own children?
Yes, but as I've said, minor parents consent for their children, but because of our culture, these minor parents still have parents to consult before they consent for their children. It's embedded in our culture. They won't make decisions about their children without, even if they're not minors, without consulting their own parents.
So I have a question for Jojo actually. So should we take consent or assent from the whole family then, the parents, the grandparents?
I don't think so, because in the end, it's the research participant who will bear the burden of the research, the risks and burdens of the research, and the benefits as well. But it's that I think by allowing them to consult their elders, that's respecting them. Which is why if it's consulting elders is embedded in culture, then definitely it should be a part of the assent process. But the eventual decision is an individual decision. But we now know that that individual decision may not be, reflect the personal conviction of the person, because it represents now the opinions of all the people he had consulted. I guess it's a cultural thing.
I'm just watching the clock and realizing that we have just about 4 minutes to go. So I think we could go on for several more hours. There's so much to talk about here. But I just want to, first of all, thank all of you, thank all the panelists for a really wonderful discussion. And just say that, one thing that it's really sort of been a light bulb in my mind that I've taken away from this discussion is that in this challenge between reconciling cultural diversity, national diversity, respect for diversity on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to work towards including children in the decisions that we make for and with them. Once when I was younger and more naive, I had hoped that we would be able to answer that question, like one is right or the other is right. I'm coming to realize that really the tension is to actually be able to try to respect both things at the same time, because they're both very important. And that's kind of the message that I've taken away from this wonderful conversation. So I will stop and thank you very much. And I know, Barbara, you're going to want to just say a few words of closure.
Yeah, I wanted to echo Steve and thank you all so much for participating today, tonight, whenever that was in your day. I also think, there are a few things that really resonated. One is these amazing, not tensions, but differences that, as Steve said, we need to figure out how to converge these different apparently conflicting views, but really which are on the ground, need to be held at once and respected at once at one time. The importance of communication and how much time this takes for people that are incredibly busy with their daily lives and taking care of patients all the time, and fitting research in as something that they feel important to do for the future understanding, but which is really on top of everything else that's being expected of them, and how different, how hard it is to set these norms when we think about a place like the Philippines that has 112 languages. How do we make sure that people are really able not only to access clinical trials, but then to participate in a knowing and understanding way, then to access the drugs at the end of that, or whatever disseminate the learning that we've done, and how hard it is to find commonality. Although I do think that part of the motivation for this is to create a future that's better than today, with greater knowledge and, protecting children, as you said, through research, not from research. And with that, I just want to really thank you all for spending this time. It was really a terrific discussion. I can't tell you how much I've learned. Thank you. Lisa?
I just want to mirror the thanks to all the speakers, all the participants for this fantastic discussion. I know our colleague Kristen has popped some information into the chat that I welcome you all to take a quick look at before you hop off, about upcoming webinars and where to access information about this webinar. So really, thanks to everyone for all this work, and I hope you go on to have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was such a
Bye-bye.
pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.